Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Hello, welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. Today we are talking to Scott Anderson from SyncThink. Scott has a really diverse background. He was a distinguished leader of the sports medicine program at Stanford University. He was there, subsequently worked alongside Dr. Jahar as part of a multidisciplinary research collaborative studying the natural history of head injuries. So over a 3-year period, Scott worked closely with Dr. Jahar to roll out investigational studies into the iSync technology. His technology looks at eye tracking, and that is the device that we'll be talking about today. So in addition to his deep product knowledge, Scott also brings market expertise in domestic, international sports organizations. He's actually a spotter and a consultant for the NFL. And prior to joining the team at SyncThink, he served as the chair of the Pac-12 Sports Medicine Committee. So it's an interesting conversation we have today with Scott, talking about their product, how they brought it to market, and the different barriers that they overcame. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Let's get started. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is Etienne Nichols. Joining me also today is Scott Anderson and, of course, your host, John Speer, founder of Greenlight Guru. Excited to be back with you guys today. So we're excited about this episode. Like I mentioned, we have Scott Anderson. He has 10 years of experience with the sports medicine program at Stanford University. He's also a consultant on the National Football League. Prior to joining the company where he is now, he served as the chair of Pac-12 Sports Medicine Committee. We'll talk more about his different background and things that he's involved in, but I'm excited to be with you all today. Scott, you want to add anything to that? I'm sure you could add a lot, I'm sure.
Well, thanks, Etienne and John, for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with you guys. And yeah, I think, it's a really exciting time for healthcare and healthcare technology. And I'm excited today to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've been working on at SyncThink and how I think my unique background, plays a part in the work that we do. So glad to be with you guys and excited to talk more about what we're up to.
Yeah. And, just to remind folks, your current role, you're the chief clinical officer at SyncThink, right?
Correct. Yep.
So we're going to talk all about that. And folks, if you're curious in the meantime, or while you're listening, you can check out SyncThink. Just go to their website and we'll talk a lot more about them here in a little bit, but it's very easy. It's syncthink.com, syncthink.com. And it's really cool technology, and I'm excited to learn more about it today.
Yeah, speaking of the technology, so why don't you tell us a little bit about it? I'm very curious about your background and how you applied it to this product, but maybe we can set the stage by talking about the product just for a moment.
Sure. Yeah. So SyncThink is a neurotechnology startup based in Silicon Valley, and we really have specialized in neurological assessment. And really how we do that is we've built a proprietary digital health platform that's based on eye tracking and capturing and recording and objectively measuring eye movements. And what people often don't really realize is that there's a whole host of neurological disorders that have a high prevalence of abnormal eye movements associated with it. And so we built this platform that leverages a virtual and or augmented reality headset that the patient wears to capture and record and analyze the patient's eye movements in a series of very brief assessments. And so we do different types of assessments to essentially measure real-time brain function. And real-time brain function can be captured accurately using virtual and augmented reality head-mounted displays that are embedded with sensors and infrared LEDs that can illuminate the eye position inside these headsets. And so this allows cameras to record what their eyes are doing, and a lot of our kind of proprietary secret sauce is built on the measurement, the algorithms, the quantification of what the eyes are actually doing relative to whatever content we provide inside the headset.
You mentioned there are lots of neuro, issues that your technology can help with or help diagnose or determine. I mean, obviously the big one that most listeners are probably familiar with, especially those sports fans out there, is concussions. That's obviously been a hot topic for the past few years. What are some of the other neurological conditions that you see where your technology can be applicable?
Yeah, and I like to look at this as in three categories. You have neurodevelopment, you have neurological function or neurological performance, and you have neurodegeneration. And what people don't actually realize, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of background on the science behind this real quick, which is that your eyes actually serve as the window to the brain and allows you to orient yourself to the things that are happening around you. And so your brain actually utilizes your eyes to become oriented to what's happening around you. And so you can interact with people and you can respond to things that are occurring in your environment. I like to say that your brain uses your eyes to select content it wants to interact with, whether that be on your phone or if something's out in my environment. I'm at a baseball game and a ball's flying at my forehead, I better do something, right? And so I have to move my eyes to select that ball, understand where it's coming from and how fast it's coming towards me. And then I have to have a sensory motor response, whether that be I yell, oh my God, or I move my head out of the way, right? So either verbal or motor actions are the result of real-time brain function. Using the eyes to orient us to what's happening and then to be able to respond to it in real time is essentially how your brain is you're operating throughout the day. And we see deficits in how this performance occurs across the lifespan. And so certain conditions that occur in children, such as autism and ADHD, in adulthood or early adulthood, we see this highly prevalent in acute injuries like concussion or vestibular disorders where people have acute attacks of dizziness. And in neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, schizophrenia even, all of these share one thing in common, or two things in common, I would say, is that traditionally they have always been diagnosed subjectively. And the clinician is used to asking the patient about their symptoms or what's happening to them in order to make a diagnosis by exclusion. And secondly, they all have a really demonstrated prevalence that's been published extensively. Some of these conditions, way back into the 60s, of having abnormal eye movements associated with them. And so what we've spent the last 15 years doing from an R&D standpoint is categorizing these abnormal eye movements and separating them out from each other to be able to show that these eye movement signatures, or what we refer to as biomarkers of disease or impairment, are unique and distinct from each other.
All right, so this might be an oversimplification, or I could be totally way off base, but you're developing technology that's leveraging neuroscience to help with diagnosis of certain neurological conditions, whereas the previous gold standard in many cases was a clinician assessing, symptoms. Not necessarily, it's not that they didn't have science, but they weren't using the neuroscience to support their decisions in some cases.
Correct. And I would take it a step further and say, in many situations, these neurospecialists were doing things like MRIs or CT scans to look at the brain. But really, that gives you information about the anatomical structure of the brain, not about the neurological function, the functional capabilities of the brain, how the neural networks connect to different aspects of the brain and how they deliver messaging to allow execution of visual processing of information. And so we've never really had this type of technology before. And I'm really bullish on this idea that this can also be, something for consumers. Like, you want to know how your brain performance is today and if it's optimized for what you're going to do for your job, or if your brain is actually functioning the way that it should be, or if you have something that's affected it. If you have drug or alcohol abuse, if you're abusing drugs and alcohol, I should say, it's going to affect your brain's real-time function. If you're sleep deprived, it's going to affect your real-time function. If you're highly caffeinated, it's going to help you optimize your function. And all of these measurements can be taken instantaneously from moment to moment. And when these behavioral modifications occur, it changes. And so we can see in real time how it changes, whether it's getting better and going up or it's getting worse and going down. And oftentimes, this follows our lifespan. And, it gets better as we grow and we develop. It's optimized while we're, young and middle-aged adults, and then it gets worse as we get older. And so being able to know that and to equip people with objective information to show them this is really critical information for clinicians, one, to make better clinical decisions, and two, to identify the appropriate therapeutic interventions that these people need in order to overcome these conditions or to at least manage them.
As I hear you talk, I'm optimistic, because I think so much about the healthcare system, especially in the United States, is reactionary. It's dealing with something that's already happened. And it's like slapping a Band-Aid on it a lot of times, or throwing a pharmaceutical at it, or what have you. But what I like about, or what I hope is the potential about what I'm hearing you describe is the ability for us as humans to be more proactive about our own healthcare, and to have, we go to the doctor to get physicals, or maybe you get a baseline EKG or whatever the case may be. Well, why shouldn't this be part of that regimen, so that I, as a human, can know where I'm at and get that early warning sign, so that I can take proactive measures before it becomes a big deal.
That's spot on. You're exactly right. And, that's what we're really keenly interested is creating more accessible access to this technology, not only within the healthcare system, but as technology evolves, we really see that there's an opportunity where potentially this could be something that is enabled on consumer devices, your phone, your Apple Watch, potentially in the future, you're hearing a lot of talk about, AR glasses, that you just wear, and, it's going to replace the cell phone. And, we think that that's something that's, highly probable, in this decade, that's likely to occur, to allow us to, I think, facilitate the migration of hospital-based care to consumer-based driven care, where you and I are dictating what type of help we need from the healthcare system by monitoring our own brain health and making decisions, to preserve it.
Very cool.
So I'm curious. So when you went through the validation, you mentioned like 10 or 15 years R&D search, or research. So as you went through, I'm sure you interacted with a lot of different patients. Did you start to almost diagnose them in your mind before you even got to the product? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we were really after is, and I'll go back a ways, like early 2000s. This started, our founder, Dr. Jam Gajar, is a neurosurgeon, and really got his start looking at this type of measurement tool or measurement capability with the Department of Defense. We had a lot of people who were having brain injuries from the Afghan wars and from an associated sequelae from, coming back from wars, having undiagnosed head injuries, having PTSD, having reliance on drug and alcohol problems to cope, over-medicating with prescriptions, those types of things. And really, he received an initial grant to look at trying to develop a measurement system for something that could be, simple and easily deployable to be used in the field of battle to justify whether or not someone should be removed from duty, because they wanted all these people were coming back from the wars with all kinds of problems, burdening, the U.S.-based healthcare system for veterans. But
not to mention their quality of life is terrible.
Yeah, and nothing was being done at the point of where the injury is occurring. Right? Nobody was saying anything, and so a year would go by, and they would come home and they'd have all these deficits. And so, really, that's where this idea came from. Was we need something that's mobile, that's very simple to use, that any, Army medic or any soldier can use in a forward field deployed capacity and get a quick measurement on somebody and determine whether or not they need to get out of there. And that was, the kind of whole basis for that. And we had a series of grants and funding that came from the Department of Defense over a 10-year period that allowed us to not only develop the technology to meet their specifications and ruggedization requirements, but also to do the studies to look for the specific unique identifiers of abnormal eye movements that occurred with traumatic brain injury. And we were able to identify this, and the military was like, okay, well, how do we know that's related to traumatic brain injury? We have, a high prevalence of ADHD in our military population. We have a high prevalence of sleep deprivation in our population. Can you study those populations as well? And so we began to study, look for signatures for ADHD and sleep deprivation, and found that those were all different and unique to each other. And so then we started saying, this is really interesting. Let's start looking at other conditions outside the military population. And it just kind of grew from there. And in 2017, after 10 years of studying this and working with the military, we received our first FDA approval through a pivotal clinical trial that we did with military soldiers, athletes, and civilians. And that allowed us to commercialize the technology beyond just, a military version. And so, we've really only been in the market for a little over 3 years, in the healthcare market, but, it's early days still for us, and technology is still evolving, but that's essentially where it started.
So right now, what are the indications for use right now? Since it's a broad spectrum, is it just brain trauma, or how do you define that?
Yes, we have a very broad and a very narrow clearance. Our initial clearance was for viewing, recording, and analyzing eye movements in human subjects in support of visual impairment identification. And so this allows us to essentially provide this technology in support of any condition where there are abnormal eye movements. So all the conditions I previously mentioned, this can be used by a clinician in order to do that. Recently, a few months ago, we received our first kind of clear indication for as an aid to concussion device or technology, probably 3 or 4 months ago, after another kind of deeper clinical study that allowed us to get a more specific clearance for that. We have additional clearances that we're targeting and going after currently to expand those even further. And I would also say too that we're in the middle of a national study for ADHD, and so that's kicked off in 2021, and we're in the middle of that right now. So it's an exciting time for us to expand those indications even further.
Very cool. So the ADHD, are you targeting youth population as well, or is it just in the adult population?
Yeah, both adult and children. Yeah, and adolescents. And
that's
so
exciting.
Yeah, and what we're really doing is, a lot of our initial studies that showed this, the presence of this biomarker in ADHD was in the military population, so it was heavily based on adults. And so what we're doing with the national study now is working with clinicians all over the U.S. to capture more data, specifically, I would say, with an emphasis on adolescents and children, to verify the presence of the biomarker in that population as well. And also to validate the changes that occur in real-time brain function during titration, because many of these patients are placed on a dosing regimen to control their ADHD, right? They're medicated. And one thing that's really interesting about our technology is that if utilized as a surveillance tool or for serial monitoring, we can see the improvement in the brain function based on the medication deployment. And so it helps the clinician learn to better titrate the medication to the individual.
I mean, I think that's huge. I mean, I don't know if big pharma will be fans of that necessarily, but I mean, I think that's, always as a parent, my kids are older now, but as they're growing up, I mean, it's crazy. And Etienne, sadly, I hope not, but here in a few years, you might have to deal with this too. But how many kids are diagnosed with ADHD or whatever the case may be and prescribed medication? And, there's litany of medications, but I always wondered, like, how does one know that that's effective? And usually it's that back to that symptoms, right? Like, oh, well, they had these symptoms before and now those symptoms have lessened, so therefore it must be effective. But it didn't seem like there was a lot of science behind it.
That's right. And I think it's our understanding of this population is still in its infancy. It seems to be highly more prevalent here in the US than in other countries. And I think, in talking to these professionals all over the US over the past, 18 months or so, it's clear that there's an urgent need for objective information and helping them manage these patients. Because, I don't think anybody feels right about putting a 7-year-old on medicine, on pills, and so I think there's something there that we're keen to evaluate further and to explore through this trial. And, to your point about the pharmaceutical companies, this is another side of our business that we do work with pharmaceutical companies. And part of when we first were commercialized, we did work with a company called Shire, who, is a heavy producer of ADHD medication. They've now been purchased by Takeda, but, we had some initial work with them on this front that gave us kind of a head start on understanding what the market opportunity was looking like.
I can imagine as a physician, I would want to prescribe therapies or whatever the case may be that I wanted some certainty to know that this was going to be effective with my patients. So I could see that being an awesome tool and a resource. And the other thing I think is interesting as we're talking, I can almost envision that the SyncThink platform could be a vehicle or a mechanism for other device developers, right? There's been so much area or focus on areas of depression and Parkinson's and even Alzheimer's, dementia, that it seems like, well, wow, maybe I should engage SyncThink and collaborate with us in some way, shape, or form to do a study that can help us design products and technologies that could be more effective.
Absolutely, and I think that's kind of our bread and butter is this. The software and analytics and the eye tracking measurement, and there's a whole host of use cases for this. And I don't know that, we're an early stage startup, and I don't know that we're going to get to all of them, right? So we're certainly keen to work with other organizations who have potential interest in pursuing those other markets. And, I think, we've been approached by those folks in the past and haven't really been, from a company standpoint in a place to be able to entertain that, because we wanted to, keep our focus on what we're doing. But I think there's a place for that in the future. And I think as technology evolves too as well, there will be, I think, several opportunities in order to, to accelerate the clinical utility of something like eye tracking for a whole host of neurological conditions.
When you went through, I'm curious if we go back in time just a little bit, were there any obstacles you really faced as you, one of the things that made me think of this was it sounds like you had almost like the perfect setup with the military, the different populations with these different, very obvious diagnosis, obvious might not be the right word, but what were some obstacles you faced though?
Well, I think it's when we were doing our clinical trials to get our first FDA clearance, it was quite a challenging endeavor, I would say, in the sense that when you're trying to essentially follow for a year concussion patients in different locations that are military, civilian, and athletes, it becomes a logistical challenge. And so what ended up happening was, this is a really interesting story actually, is that we had two research groups, one in New York, Boston area, and one in Northern California. And we built and fashioned and retrofitted like Winnebago, basically, and built the whole inside of testing booths. And we had, whenever we register somebody, we had different time points in which we had to reassess them. And so we take the Winnebago to their location and do the follow-up testing. And so we were basically, mobile on wheels, going through New York and Massachusetts, all over those states, and also, Northern California, to be able to track these people down and capture them in their locations, whether they're at home or at their sporting venue or, at the Army base or wherever they were. And so I think, it took a small army of people on our side to be able to pull this off. We had a significant research organization working on this to make sure that we were doing it correctly and following all the protocols. So, it was an extensive effort to get 10,000 people,
Etienne, I have a slight variant of your question. I mean, so Scott, when you talked about the initial focus was for military applications, and then as the team got into that, they realized, there's a potential application over here and one over here and one over here. That seems like a good, bad problem to have. Good in that there's lots of potential use cases. Bad maybe in that it distracts your focus.
Right.
So can you speak to sort of the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, I think people always talk, especially here in Silicon Valley, about not boiling the ocean as an early stage startup, right? And that's something I think that we were very hyper aware of, like knowing our limitations and knowing that there's tremendous market potential for this, and there's potentially a lot of opportunities for us to, I think, grow and scale our technology into different use cases. But I think we really had the mentality that we really needed to drill down our focus into areas that we knew that we were good at. Our founder is a clinical specialist in concussion. I am as well. And, it's kind of like the first step for us was to focus on that because we knew the market. We knew how to pull off the studies where we had treated people with those conditions for, a number of years and for decades even. And we had done prior studies in those with the military. And so I think it was all, once we sat down and decided, like, what are we doing? We could go for 5 or 10 of these things. It was either, raise $250 million in a seed round or be logical and focus on what we knew best and grow from there.
That's awesome. So you said 10,000. So my head's trying to get wrapped around that number for a validation. That's how many people you were following?
Yep. Yeah. We had 10,000 subjects, ages 7 to 70. It took, I would say, 2 years really to identify these individuals and track them longitudinally and test them at different time points. So it was quite the effort.
Wow. That makes me feel pretty good about the technology. That's a good number.
Yes. We do pride ourselves in having the largest kind of normative eye tracking database in the world. And a large part of that is because of, the clinical studies that we had done previously, prior to commercialization.
Well, I'm excited about the big data behind it. Did you have to sync up with other, databases of information? For example, when you talk about sleep deprivation, that's seems like a moving target based on the person you're talking to. I'm just curious how you define some of those things.
Yeah, I think in many situations, our preliminary studies looking at sleep deprivation was done with military soldiers because, I don't know if people know this, but there are certain conditions under which the military purpose sleep deprived soldiers. And so we were very lucky to be part of some of those, to have access to those populations while they were going through that process. And we actually, Fort Natick, Army base is known for doing a lot of unique things with technology and also doing some really interesting things to soldiers to see how they respond. And so we worked very closely with the folks at Fort Natick over a period of years to do different sleep deprivation studies. And that's where we got our original kind of signature pickup from those studies. And then from there, as we did additional trials, we had to be very careful about the conditions in which these people were sleep deprived, right? Like we couldn't just take their word for it. We had to really have a very, I think, specific protocol that they had to follow. And, you have people that drop out of studies like that because it is a moving target, right? So you do the best you can and you look for the consistency in, the participation and you try to do the best you can.
Cool. Any other stories about, as you were going, from different places to different places, looking at the concussions? Obviously, you're served as a consultant on the National Football League. Any thoughts on that or how that went?
Yeah. So what I do for the NFL is different than my day job with SyncThink. I'm part of the concussion protocol for the NFL and have been active for, I just finished my 10th or 11th season, something like that. And so I've been doing it for a long time. And really my job is to, serve as a injury observer on game days. And so I, basically am the guy that sits up in the booth and pulls people off the field and communicates to the sidelines to have those players evaluated. It initially started as, something that is specific to concussion, and you look for certain, criteria that makes you suspicious in order for that to justify them to get evaluated, but it's grown to musculoskeletal injuries and other things as well. And so it's a very unique program. I actually enjoy it, and I think it's definitely made the game safer, having eyes in the sky to communicate with folks, and we provide a whole host of video feeds from different camera angles, and we pipe them down to the sidelines so that the medical staff for each team can view the injury from the angle at which it's best to be viewed at, and so it gives them some insight into the mechanism of injury and the severity of injury as well.
I just can imagine your setup on game day. You have like a whole wall of screens of things that are happening. So
yeah, I have a couple of technicians that work with me in the booth, and then there's one on each sideline. And the technicians that are with me in the booth have like a joystick controller. And this allows them to select the different views and to rotate the play and to slow it down, speed it up. And we have a whole tagging system that goes into a database. And it's really interesting. But it's also, I think when I explain this to people, they think it's fun, but it's also can be very nerve-wracking because, you have to make decisions that are going to affect outcomes of games potentially by taking people.
You're trying to do what's right for those athletes. I can imagine it makes it difficult to be a fan at the same time. So
it is. I cannot watch a game now, college or professional, without looking at it through that lens, because I'm just constantly pointing out, oh, that person just injured this, or this person just, so it's less enjoyable, I'd say.
Well, and obviously concussion awareness is one of the higher profile, potential applications of SyncThink. And as you were talking about that, I was reminded, Greenlight worked with a company a few years ago who they had developed this thing. I think they call it the Q collar. Have you heard of this thing?
Yep.
And, it's basically like a thing you wear around your neck. And, just hearing about the development of that tech, because up until that point, and probably even yet still, a lot of helmet manufacturers were trying to modify the designs of their helmets to prevent that. But it's like, that seems like the wrong approach. But that Q collar is really interesting. And I'll have to look it up to see where they are. But they had some pretty promising results, I know, in their early studies.
Yeah, they did.
Have you heard of that? The Q collar?
Yeah, priority designs.
But yeah, it's kind of cool. It's simple, how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I love how sometimes the simplest designs are the best. They just looked at that woodpecker. It's like, why doesn't a woodpecker get a concussion? It's just that, around the neck. That's very cool. Yeah, Scott, I know they're cleared in the United States now. So it's pretty exciting to see that. One of the interesting things about them, and I'll let you talk just a second. Sorry, they went as I believe just a device that could be sold, and then they became a medical device that, I know yours is a diagnostic for a medical device. Now you're FDA cleared. Any thoughts on those different pathways? Maybe not them specifically, but just curious if you toyed with those ideas.
Yeah, I don't, like I said, I think there's something that I think you walk the line between protective equipment, so to speak, or, a medical device that can prevent, a situation from happening or enable the evaluation of an event from happening or from an event that has happened. So I think, part of this is, in my opinion, is, there's this convergence happening between technology and enterprise/healthcare use cases where everybody, I think, particularly with XR technology, AR and VR, is rushing towards healthcare. Right? There are so many applications where VR and AR and I would say biometric devices can be used for healthcare purposes. Everyone's rushing towards that. But what's also happening simultaneous to that, in the swim lane next to it, is that consumers are taking more and more ownership over their healthcare, over their health data, and managing it themselves, right? They're with wearables and sleep trackers and activity monitors. There's this. I think there's a natural convergence happening, and where these are going to collide, and we're going to be leveraging these consumer devices for healthcare purposes. Look at the Apple Watch. Think about how many. The Apple Watch has an FDA clearance. It's a consumer device. And I think. We're going to see a lot more of that in the future. I think, as we, like I mentioned before, as we get to consumer glasses, these things are going to be able to detect all kinds of different problems. You're going to be able to use your phone. Your phone's going to be able to tell you, whether or not you have certain potential neurological or musculoskeletal disorders just based on the jitter in your hands, or how often your hands are, or how tightly the hand is gripping the device. And then when we get to, I'm really excited about the potential of contact lenses, smart contact lenses, to be able to, basically operate as augmented reality fields to help filter information, and can be voice directed or eye directed towards a whole host of conditions. So I think these are going to be naturally, I think the future is where we're going to see a lot of this happen, where we're going to be able to use medical data or patient data that's derived from the consumer for healthcare use cases. The medical devices of today are also going to become consumer devices, and vice versa. So it's really interesting.
Well, and not just the medical devices are going to become consumer devices, but the tech that we all have, the consumer devices, are going to have medical device applications within them. And I'm with you. I'm excited about that. I've talked with guests in the past, like a lot of we'll just say fitness trackers, the things that people are wearing on their wrists or what have you. Those are not really regulated by and large by FDA right now. They're determined to be a general wellness device.
Yep.
So I think, from a regulatory point of view, I think those companies, to make that leap from being a consumer device to a medical device, there's a leap.
Yep.
And by the same token, I hope FDA and other regulatory bodies are, I know what I'm about to say is maybe in the category of an oxymoron, but I hope they're quick and nimble and adaptable enough to be able to accommodate that as well. And I know that there's lots of programs underway at FDA to try to accommodate, but these things are moving way, way more quickly than the regulations can keep up with.
Well said. Yeah, I think when SAMD came out initially, software as a medical device, that was the first kind of formalized effort, and I think you see a lot of people running at that, right? Like, can we leverage software that can exist on a consumer device or on a proprietary medical device to be used for healthcare purpose? I think that's the first step. I think we're going to see others as well. But I agree. I think there's a long way to go before they match the speed of innovation with technology. So it's challenging.
Yeah. Well, it's exciting. I'm excited to see the future for SyncThink, and it's exciting to hear what you've accomplished so far.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I think, we move at the pace of technology, and I think, the next 5 years are going to be really, really fast in terms of how technology evolves. And I think we're going to see a lot of evolution in terms of how our products and services reach the market and for the different use cases that we talked about.
Absolutely.
Very cool.
Scott, I appreciate you sharing so much today. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's great to be with you guys.
All right. Well, we'll let you get back to it. As to our listeners, thank you for listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast. If you want to know more, go over to the greenlight.guru website, and we'll direct you to more information on SyncThink, as well as Greenlight Guru's Global Medical Device platform.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks.